In the early hours of a Thursday that began like any other diplomatic session in Vienna, the permanent representative of Iran to the International Atomic Energy Agency stood up before a silent room, opened a briefcase bearing the emblem of the Islamic Republic, and read a 47-word statement that, for all practical purposes, ended 3 years of nuclear negotiations. Tehran was formally withdrawing from the enhanced inspection framework of the interim agreement signed with the United States, and it did so without prior warning, without prior consultation with the other signatories, and without offering any window for reversal. The agreement had been torn up in front of the world, and the world in that exact moment still did not grasp the sheer scale of what it had just lost. The number that sizes up this collapse is this. According to consolidated estimates by the Institute for Science and International Security, Iran was operating at the moment of the rupture approximately 64 advanced cascades of IR-6 centrifuges, each capable of enriching uranium at a speed 10 times faster than the first-generation centrifuges that the original 2015 deal had capped. In practical terms, this installed capacity meant that the so-called breakout time, the interval required to amass enough fissile material for a nuclear warhead, had shrunk from 12 months, the threshold considered safe by the international community, to somewhere between 7 and 12 days. 7 days, the equivalent of the gap between 2 UN Security Council meetings. The equation had shifted, and here was the paradox that the planners had not accounted for. The interim agreement that Iran had just torn up was not, at its core, an Iranian concession. It was an American concession. Washington had agreed to unfreeze approximately $16 billion in Iranian assets, held up in the South Korean banking system, and at the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, in exchange for a pledge from Tehran to keep enrichment below 60% and allow inspections at previously declared facilities. Iran got the money. It used it to bankroll the expansion of the ballistic missile program of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military and economic force to the Iranian state. And then it shredded the commitment it had given in return. The diplomatic weapon Washington had deployed to contain the nuclear program was, at that very moment, funding its acceleration. But the true fallout of this rupture went far beyond the numbers in the nuclear arena. Step back for a moment and look at the big picture. The Iranian withdrawal from the inspections deal happened exactly 11 days after the start of a fresh wave of Houthi strikes against commercial shipping in the southern Red Sea. Attacks that, according to United States Central Command reports, utilized Iranian-made anti-ship missiles with upgraded guidance systems that had not been seen prior to 2025. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the 27-mile-wide choke point through which roughly 12% of global maritime trade flows, including 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, had morphed into a permanent operational red zone. The insurance premium for vessels transiting the Red Sea had skyrocketed from 0.05% of the cargo value to over 1% in less than 4 months, a 20-fold surge that, translated into everyday terms, meant each container shipped between Asia and Europe cost anywhere from $500 to $2,000 more than the previous year. This is not just a matter of territory on a map. It is a matter of who holds the keys to the energy arteries of the 21st century. And here was the data point that mainstream reports were not highlighting as often as it deserved. Iran was not acting alone in this escalation. The link between the planet's 2 major flashpoints, the Middle East and Eastern Europe, had never been so operationally tangible. Moscow, according to analysis by the Royal United Services Institute in London, had transferred to Iran electronic warfare technology captured from Western systems supplied to Ukraine, in exchange for a steady stream of Shahed drones and, more recently, Fath 360 short-range ballistic missiles. The feedback loop was ruthless in its efficiency. Western weapons captured on the Ukrainian frontline fed the technical intelligence that allowed Iran to tweak the missiles its proxies fired at Western ships in the Red Sea. Each front fueled the other. The board had been flipped. In a moment, you will understand why a specific detail regarding the American response completely alters the nature of this crisis. But first, there was a human layer that needs to be addressed so the scale of this diplomatic meltdown becomes concrete. Arthur, the Iranian diplomat who spearheaded the negotiations on Tehran's behalf since 2023, was described by European counterparts as the most pragmatic of the remaining Iranian negotiators, a man who spoke fluent English with a British accent picked up during years on assignment in London, and who kept, according to Financial Times reports, a back channel open with the American State Department even during times of peak rhetorical tension between the two nations. Arthur is not the emotional centerpiece of this breakdown. He is the coordinate that exposes the pattern of what the Iranian regime consumes. Even its most dialogue-oriented diplomats were ultimately weaponized to rubber stamp the rupture. Pragmatism was used as a smokescreen and tossed aside once it served its purpose. In the shadow of this monumental strategic blunder, there was an actor watching it all with calculated satisfaction. And here was the player the headlines were missing as often as the facts demanded: China. Beijing had signed, in the 12 months leading up to the Iranian pullout, Iranian oil import contracts at an average discount of $15 to $20 a barrel below the Brent crude price, a markdown that, according to estimates by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, translated to roughly $14 billion in annual savings for independent Chinese refineries known as teapots. The more cut off Iran became from the Western financial system, the more reliant it grew on China as the buyer of last resort, and the cheaper Beijing managed to scoop up the oil, powering its industrial engine. The collapse of the deal for China was not a crisis. It was a bargain. Every additional sanction the West slapped on Iran made the Iranian barrel cheaper for the only buyer massive enough to shrug off those sanctions. The paradox had come full circle. And then we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with enough clarity. What was the American response, and why was it described as unthinkable? And here is what that detail shifted. Washington did not respond with more sanctions. It did not convene the Security Council. It did not issue an ultimatum. What the United States did do was authorize, according to 3 Pentagon sources speaking to Reuters the week after the rupture, the pre-positioning of GBU-57 munitions, the so-called massive ordnance penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs designed exclusively to obliterate fortified underground facilities at the Diego Garcia Air Base in the Indian Ocean. Each unit of these bombs, which can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, costs roughly $3.5 million and was developed with a single operational goal: to strike facilities buried more than 200 feet deep, exactly the estimated depth of the Fordo enrichment plant, carved into a mountain just outside the city of Qom. The United States was not making threats. It was making placements. The historical analogy that most accurately captures this dynamic is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, tempting as the comparison may be. It is Operation Opera in 1981, when Israel destroyed the Iraqi Osirak nuclear reactor in a preemptive airstrike that the world publicly condemned and quietly applauded. The parallel is not flawless, but 2 specific traits make it illuminating. First, the choice to act unilaterally when multilateral consensus falls short. Second, the calculus that the political fallout of a preemptive strike is always less than the strategic toll of letting a hostile regime cross the nuclear threshold. In '81, the world condemned Israel at the General Assembly, and a decade later acknowledged that the flattening of Osirak had stopped Simon from possessing nuclear weapons during the invasion of Kuwait. The question no spokesperson was tackling head-on was this: was Washington drawing up the exact same calculus for Fordo? Think hard about what this number actually represents on the ground. The Iranian breakout time of 7 to 12 days meant that from the second Tehran made the political call to build a warhead, to the moment it had enough fissile material to pull it off, the window would be tighter than the time needed for American satellites to spot the shift, the intel to climb the chain of command, the president to authorize a strike, and the bombers to take flight. For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, a state was potentially closer to crossing the line than the Western surveillance grid was capable of flagging in a timely manner. The era of cheap, feared attacks was over for good. The era of risky, definitive, preemptive defense had officially begun. Every passing day was another day of heat on European allies, and the Gulf states that leaned hardest on the stability of the Strait of Hormuz and who would squeeze Washington with a pressure the White House sooner or later could not brush off. Saudi Arabia, which had poured over $300 billion into the Vision 2030 program to pivot its economy away from oil, saw the Iranian nuclear program as an existential threat that no diplomatic haggling had managed to diffuse. Riyadh had already signaled, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, that it would chase its own nuclear capabilities if Iran crossed the threshold, a move that would turn the Persian Gulf into the most densely packed region of emerging nuclear powers on Earth. The domino effect was not hypothetical. It was in the blueprint stage. And here is what that layer unmasked about the deeper nature of this crisis. Iran did not rip up the deal because it felt powerful. It ripped it up because the clock was running out. American and European sanctions, tightened since 2023, had slashed Iranian oil export revenues from roughly $80 billion a year at their pre-sanction peak to somewhere around $35 to $40 billion. Factoring in the forced discounts and the overhead of bypassing the Western banking system through middlemen in Dubai, Istanbul, and Hong Kong, the Iranian rial had shed over 80% of its exchange value over a decade. Domestic inflation was running north of 40% a year. The regime desperately needed a strategic win to justify the pain inflicted on its own people, and a showcase of nuclear capability was the only bargaining chip left on the table. The plan had backfired, not because the enemy was tougher, but because the domestic economy could no longer shoulder the weight of the ambition. What irreversibly changed that Thursday in Vienna was not the status of the Iranian nuclear program that had already been creeping forward for years under the helpless gaze of partial inspections. What changed was the risk calculus of every player on the board. Israel began operating on the assumption that the window for preemptive action had narrowed to weeks. Washington began positioning strike capabilities that only make sense if the trigger decision is already locked in. And Beijing began weighing just how much cheap Iranian crude made up for the gamble of getting dragged into a nuclear showdown in the Persian Gulf, the very region from which China ships in over 40% of its oil. The question defining the next chapter of this standoff is not whether Iran will manage to build a warhead. It is whether someone will pull the trigger before Tehran even gets the chance to decide, and what the tab will be for whoever shoots first. The bombs were already on the tarmac. The decision, not yet. If this issue defines what you want to keep tracking with the depth it demands, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below on which angle of this crisis you want to see unpacked in the next video, because this file was far from closed.